So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Sure, go ahead.
The Liberals would say that Trudeau's done a really good job of bringing women into politics and sort of like creating a good policies for women. What would you answer to that?
I don't think they've done a very good job at all, and I think most women in Canada would agree with that. A lot of women, of course, thought that they were going to get see some real advancement after the Liberals were elected, because there were all these promises, with Trudeau saying he was a feminist and all the rest of it. But the key things that are important to women have to do with closing the wage gap. For example, women make less than 70 cents on the dollar that a man would make. And that gap has actually grown bigger in the last 4 years, not smaller. And here we are talking about white women. If we're talking about racialized women or Indigenous women, of course the gap is much greater, or Indigenous men, or racialized men. So the closing the wage gap is absolutely a priority. We want to see equitable employment equity and pay equity, which is, there is legislation, but we want to see it universal over all sections of the economy, so private sector and public sector. And we want to see that gap closed quickly. If we had a government with the will to do it, we would see those kinds of changes, but unfortunately this would involve tackling corporations, and this is a government that's not willing to do that. Another area that's important to women is reproductive health. So this government says they are in favor of a women's right to choice, to birth or abortion, and yet access to abortion services and reproductive health services is becoming increasingly limited across the country. There are no services available in the Maritimes, for example. So sure, you have the right to an abortion, but you're going to have to spend a lot of money traveling to get one, and waiting in line furthermore, which is a big issue for women who are looking to terminate a pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy. Another issue, of course, for women is childcare, and this is actually for families. So the Liberals promised in 1993 a national childcare program. They haven't delivered, and they're not even talking about childcare in this election campaign. So we want to see action to create a national childcare program, a pan-Canadian program that's public and that's free. So, and the reason is that in this country women work, and if they're not working, they're looking for work. And we have it's a social responsibility to look after our children, to make sure that they are safe while their parents are working. And they've been able to do this in Quebec for some years. They've had a provincial system of quality public childcare at a cost of $7 a day. Well, we think it should be free, but if we're going to start with $7 a day, we're good with that, and we're moving in the direction of free. The main thing is to have a public child care system. And I think the other issue that is important, well, there are many issues that are important to women, but the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women has made its report. There are very important recommendations in there with respect to safety and security and well-being of Indigenous women, and those recommendations should be implemented forthwith. And the fact that they haven't been implemented is an indication of why we're not happy with the Liberals, and women are not happy with what they've received. Perhaps a quick word about the Conservative Party. So they want to reopen, or some of their candidates do, they want to reopen the debate on abortion rights. And they do not support the rights of the LGBTQ community, for example. They try to hide this, and they certainly try to zip the mouths of their candidates so that they don't come out with their really right-wing ideas and anti-choice, anti-women, anti-people ideas. But that's the reality. Those are their real positions, and people should know that before they vote. Anybody else? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, What's your party's position on like Quebec separatism? It doesn't seem to have been talked much about this election period.
Right. Okay, good question. Thank you for that. Well, I guess that in our view, Canada is not one nation, but is a multinational state, and French speakers in Quebec constitute the nation of Quebec. The English-speaking majority in the country, the largest nation in Canada. We are also a nation. Indigenous people are comprised of nations as well, and so are the Acadians, who live on the ground of mostly New Brunswick and some parts of Nova Scotia. And you know, the true history of Canada is that it was built at the point of a gun. So when the colonial powers first arrived in Canada, they wanted the land and resources that belongs to Indigenous people, and their solution was to kill all of the Indigenous people and seize their lands and resources. This is genocide. And this is the conclusion, by the way, not only of our party, but of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it's absolutely correct. And these genocidal policies have continued up to the present, including the residential schools, the highway of tears, in which missing and murdered women this has continued for many years without any action by governments to safeguard women. We also think that the Acadians are a nation. They are arrived in Canada from a different part of France, and their history is different. And if we want to correct this, then we have to correct the basis of the foundation of Canada. Instead of being an imperialist country, we need a new equal and voluntary partnership in which all of the nations are equal, and each have the right to separate if they wish. We don't think separation is in the best interests of any of the nations of Canada, but we respect the right of each to choose to do that if they so wish. And I think the best way for Canadians to understand this, particularly English-speaking Canadians, is to equate it with the right to divorce. Because women have the right to divorce, and men too, it doesn't mean that we are advocating that everybody should go and get a divorce. It means that this is an essential condition for equality, so that if women, for example, are in a relationship in which they are abused or do not want to continue to be in that relationship, there's an exit, there's a way to get out. But it also gives them the leverage to approve the terms of their marriage and to take an unhappy marriage and make it a happy one. And in terms of Canada, the way to address this is to have we think, a House of Nationalities, instead of the Senate, to abolish the Senate and create a House of Nationalities, and that laws that would be passed in Canada would have to pass through the current Parliament, the House of Commons, which is based on representation by population, but also through a House of Nationalities, in which representation from Canada's main national groups would be also required. Then you could have a new deal for Canada, for all Canadians, that would be a democratic arrangement, and you would see an arrangement of a much friendlier relationship, and you would be likely to see much less straining at the ropes, which are currently forcing the people of Quebec, and one of those ropes that's forcing them is the Clarity Act, which was introduced by the Liberals at the time of the last vote on separation. which makes it virtually impossible for any of Canada's nations to opt to depart and set up their own state if they wish to. If we want to see one united Canada, we have to organize democratic terms in which there is genuine equality and in which is a voluntary partnership. Otherwise, this will not go away. So we stand for equality and democracy, and that begins by recognizing that Canada is a multinational country, not just an English-speaking country. Hope that answers your question. Sure, go ahead.
With our problems with Donald Trump down south, like, how do we deal with tyrants like that? What would the Communist Party's position be on dealing with the Donald Trump and these kind of neo-fascist types that are coming up?
Well, that's a good question and a timely one as well. So we think that that we need a Canadian government which is prepared in the first place to defend Canada's sovereignty and independence as a sovereign nation, and that we should not be simply signing on to U.S. foreign policy or U.S. directives. And that means that we think that the United Nations is an important body, and that while it certainly needs democratic reforms, it is the place to work out political solutions to international problems, and not use force, which is the preferred way of resolving questions by President Trump and by the U.S. Administration around him. They are all about aggression and violence, overthrowing governments, and it would appear that they're also not very interested in the United Nations. So we think that we should be getting out of deals which tie Canada to the U.S. and to these kinds of policies, like, for example, for the free trade agreements, or NATO, NORAD defense agreements, which involve Canada and various U.S. dirty wars and military jaunts around the world. We want all of Canada's troops to repatriate to Canada. We want to bring them back to Canada. We don't want to be involved in any more secret undercover coup d'etat, or any open ones either, that are being orchestrated by the U.S. and that Canada's being invited to or told to participate in. So we need a government that's prepared to do those kinds of things. I think it's also important to note that what is happening in the United States is also happening in Europe, where we are seeing very right-wing governments elected. Some fascist governments exist in Europe now, and I'm thinking of Ukraine, for example, and some other countries. There are fascists who have been elected, parties that have elected members of parliament. We can look at France and see the right-wing movement there of the Le Pens, which is, in other countries as well. Also in Latin America, we're seeing fascist governments replacing progressive ones. And we see Modi in India, the Modi government, which has been described as a fascist government. And when we see Trump in the United States, and we see the Conservative Party here in Canada, and the anti-party, Maxime Bernier's anti-party, and both of these parties are one is a split off from the other, but both of them have connections with people like Ezra Levant, Charles McVety, Faith Goldie, a woman who's a white supremacist and so awful that she's been banned from Facebook, so that takes some doing. And that doesn't make the Conservative Party a fascist party, but it is the party which has links with fascist organizations. And this is very distressing and should be very disturbing to Canadians. The Liberal Party doesn't have those connections, although we have to note that the Liberals and Justin Trudeau did vote for the Tories' Barbaric Cultural Practices Act and snitch line in the Harper government. So there is no, by making these observations about the Conservative Party and the far right in this country, it's not to say that the Liberals are somehow an alternative. They're not. They're a big business party, and they reflect the interests of big business. And big business at this point, and the Canadian government at this point, certainly appears to have tied itself to the Trump administration, which is very, very, very distressing. Sure, go ahead.
What the Communist Party going to do about the drug deaths?
Well, thanks very much. That's a very important and very timely question. We see drug deaths in Canada as in part a result of years of austerity and an effort by the United States government, right-wing governments, that started with the war on drugs, and that this has all contributed to the drug crisis in Canada. There are those in the Conservative Party, for example, who want to see the current opioid crisis as a law and order question, that it should be dealt with simply by arresting people and putting them in prison. We see this as a part of the health crisis, and that we need to be looking at it from the perspective of health. And so we favor harm reduction, so safe injection sites, for example, needle exchanges, and the kind of social supports and health supports that will help people to survive their addictions in the first place, by making it possible for people to inject drugs, etc., in a safe setting, and not be subject to the poisonous stuff that is often circulating in the country. But secondly, also to provide them with the supports that they need in terms of economic, mental health supports, social workers, and dealing with addictions as a health issue and not as a legal issue. And we know that a lot of people who are suffering from these kinds of addictions are actually the victims of austerity and the victims of the economic system that we are in, the economic crisis that many people are facing, and that this is a way of self-medicating for many people who are in serious trouble. So it's a health issue, and what we're looking is at harm reduction and the supports that people need to overcome their addictions, not throwing people in jail. Anybody else? Sure, go ahead.
As a student, I feel like post-secondary is essentially designed to just create debt, and I don't know what I'm going to do once I graduate.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question too, so thanks for that. Well, we agree with you. We think that a lot of students now are faced with really a very difficult choice if they want to go on to post-secondary, particularly university. Unless their parents are very wealthy, they're going to have to decide whether they want to take on an enormous debt, which in many cases, just for an undergraduate degree, will amount to $30,000 or $40,000. In other words, the size of a small mortgage. At the same time, we are hearing from governments at all levels that the world of work is changing, and that we need workers in Canada who are going to be able to deal with the new technology and so forth. And so the obvious solution is for the Canadian government to invest in education, post-secondary education. And these investments mean that they should be funding the institutions, and students should not be charged the enormous tuition fees that they are being charged. We want to see we want to abolish tuition fees. So post-secondary education should be free. It should be accessible to all who are interested in post-secondary education and who have the marks to get into school. We also want to eliminate current debts that have been accumulated by students from as a result of the post-secondary education that they may be currently taking. And we also want to pay students a stipend to cover their living costs while they are studying. So this is an investment that will be a considerable investment, but it will have great returns in terms of having a very highly educated workforce in Canada that will put us in a very good position for the future. Sometimes people ask us, well, how are you going to pay for it? So this seems like a good moment to to say, well, you should pay for it by cutting the military spending and the arms budgets in Canada. We want to cut them by 75% and use those funds for healthcare, for education, a national child care program, and so forth, job creation, raising the minimum wage, and post-secondary education, and public education as well. And we also want to increase corporate taxes. It's taxation that should pay for and the social revenues that should pay for social programs and for education and for healthcare. So the question is not that there is no money. How you plan to pay for it? There is plenty of money. The question is a government which is willing to secure those funds and to direct them towards socially useful purposes like post-secondary education.
Thank you.
Could you speculate on what would happen if there's a minority government? And like, because in the past, when we had a conservative minority, liberals supported them all the time, it seemed like, and kept them in power. So if we were going to have a conservative minority again, or a liberal minority, and we elected some communists to it, what might that look like in Ottawa?
Well, we think actually thanks for that question, because we think that in this election, the best thing that could, the best result would be a minority government in which neither the Liberals nor the Tories had a majority. And the reason is that a minority government situation is one in which the public has the most leverage and can exert pressure on whichever party forms government and prevent them from implementing the worst parts of their program. And if, in addition to a minority government, we also had a large progressive bloc, including communists elected. We have 30 communists. We think that would be very important if they were elected. It would change the face of Parliament. That we could also see some parts of a people's agenda implemented. So, for example, perhaps we could see proportional representation, which Canadians thought they were going to get from the last Liberal government, and which should be, it was long overdue as a democratic electoral reform in this country. We could also see some action on housing. We could also, I think, see some reductions in military spending. We could certainly see, I think, action, or we would certainly have a mass movement pressing Parliament for real action on carbon emissions, reducing carbon emissions. And that would be extremely important, that and military spending, slashing military spending and changing our foreign policy. So I think this wouldn't be enough to see really fundamental changes, but it could see some significant changes, important changes, and perhaps make the case with Canadians that more progressive governments are needed, more left-wing governments are needed. And it would also bring up the date of the next election when it might be possible to do that. Yeah, sure, you had a question.
I just took a look at your platform, and you have such a good platform, and the question is that how come not many people jumping on your board?
Well, actually, I think quite a few people are jumping on board. We see a lot of people who get to see our platform because we give it to them, or they get it in their, at a subway station or bus stop, because we give it to them, and they look at it and they say, "This is great stuff. Why is it that it's only the Communist Party that has a platform like this with the 15 points that we have?" And I think the answer, it's a good question, because in the past you would have seen the NDP with a program very similar to this. And unfortunately, the NDP is not advocating these kinds of policies anymore, at least not the whole spectrum of the policy. I think that we are seeing quite an upturn in interest in the Communist Party's policies and in the Communist Party. And we're seeing it through increased donations, increased applications to join our party, requests for lawn signs, which we didn't used to have, and things like this. So there is increased interest. But at the same time, there is also an increased effort to black out what we have to say. We're having real difficulties, for example, getting our message, anything about the Communist Party, covered in media coverage of the election campaign. If you didn't know that there was a Communist Party with 30 candidates in this election campaign, you would never find out by reading the local newspapers or the national newspapers, by watching CBC, the people's television and radio stations, because they will not cover what we have to say, even though we are the second oldest political party in Canada. And at the same time, you will see coverage of the anti-people parties of Maxime Bernier, a very right-wing, extremely right-wing party, which has been involved in hate speech, many of its candidates and certainly its leaders, and they get lots of coverage. So I think this has to do in part with the decisions that are made in the back rooms by powerful people in the media who are attached to the Liberal and Conservative parties, that they are afraid that people are going to be very interested in the platform that we have to offer, and they have decided they're going to make sure that as few people as possible know about it, and that it will be entirely up to our members and supporters to get the message out about our platform. They're not going to give us any space at all in the big media in this country, and so that also tells you that they are worried. Yes, we are a small party, but I would say our party has the biggest ideas in this election campaign, or for that matter in this country, of any political party. And they're very concerned, for example, about a recent public opinion poll, which showed that more than 50% of the Canadians who were polled had a very favorable view of socialism. And if I was the CEO of a big corporation, that would scare the pants off me. So I think that there is quite a lot of interest in our policies and in socialism. We are Canada's party of socialism. People want to know more. They want to check us out. But those are the people who have some access to us in the first place. And there is a new, I would say there is a new Cold War that is opening up, not only against the Communist Party, but also against the Communist Party, also against the trade union movement and progressive organizations. This is a very dangerous trend, and one that I hope that Canadians will recognize and will oppose. But anybody who's interested in our platform can find us on the internet. Our address is www.communist-party.ca, and there you can see the whole 9 yards and then some more. So thanks for the question.
I'm curious about the Conservatives are talking about an energy corridor and bringing Canadian resources to Canadian markets, which would sort of seem to be like good for the nation. What would your party's position be on that?
Well, the energy corridor that they're talking about is pipelines. And we are opposed to any kind of pipelines that are intended to move dirty oil, bitumen, from the Alberta tar sands to the ocean. And for all the reasons that I think are pretty well known to anybody who's looking into the issue at all. The danger to the environment is a key concern. The danger of spills on the coast in British Columbia, for example. Also, some of the pipelines that have been proposed on the eastern end go right over, very close to the Great Lakes. which is the largest source of fresh water in North America. And many of the big cities in the United States as well as Canada depend on that water. And the world depends on the fresh water in the Great Lakes for that matter. So no, we're not interested in that kind of energy corridor at all. What we would like to see is an east-west power grid that's built on renewable energy. And I say, so renewables, by which I mean hydro, geothermal energy, solar, wind, and I'm sure there are going to be new alternative and renewable sources of energy developed as we move forward. We'd like to see those renewables as part of a publicly owned energy grid. So we're not supportive of the Green Party's plans, for example, for private development of these sources of energy. They should be in public hands. East-west, because we want to make sure that the current situation in Canada is a north-south relationship. So I think it was 2003 or 2004, there was the whole province of Ontario was blacked out because of a power problem in the U.S. So why we should, and at the same time there was a surplus of power in Manitoba, which we could have drawn on and prevented a blackout that lasted 3 or 4 days and in which some people died. So east-west power, so we meet the needs of Canada and Canadians first, exports second. We should also have a higher price for exports of energy. But not dirty oil and not gas either. We're opposed to fracking and to the liquid natural gas proposals for British Columbia and other places as well. Don't know if does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's good, thank you.
Thanks very much. Is there anything else, or are we done tonight? Well, thank you, everybody. So glad that you all come tonight. Thank you very much.